Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today's video is on the background simulation of Elite Dangerous. And I looked around a lot and I can't find any videos that are more recent than like 6 years ago on the BGS or how it works. And because basically every single action that any commander does interacts with the BGS, I wanted to make an up-to-date guide on it. And I've compiled as much info as I can find from a couple different sources, and I'll list them when I use them. But I also have a lot of experience and just general knowledge from it, so it's kind of a mix of both those sources. But anyways, this video will be divided into 3 parts. What is the BGS, how does it work, and how to manipulate it. And so we'll start off with what is the BGS. And basically the BGS is all the mechanics in the background of Elite that determine which factions control what systems, what's available in markets, and how safe a system is. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you are a faction leader or you're in a faction, you might care about the BGS, or if you have a system that you like and you want to make sure that your missions are as good as possible, then, you could work on the BGS and make it, a better system. And it's actually very interesting. As of April 3307, Frontiers reported that there are over 25,000 player minor factions in the galaxy. Yeah, but on to the mechanics. So how does the BGS work? The BGS is composed of several factors which work in tandem to determine how a system or faction is doing. And these factors are influence, which determines a faction's control over the system, the state, and that's the current condition of the faction, and then the government and population. Starting off with influence. Influence is a percentage-based scale for control over systems. There's 100% influence in every system, and that's divided between all the factions. And the faction with the most influence, the highest percentage, is the controlling faction. And the controlling faction also actually controls the main starport, which is the closest one to the drop-in point. It's basically used as the primary scale by most player factions to determine how well a faction is doing in that system. Next up is government and population. These are factors that the player can't really interact with, and they're chosen by the faction leader or whenever they're put in. There are 11 government types, which are anarchy, corporation, cooperative, communist, confederacy, democracy, dictatorship, feudal, patronage, theocracy, and prison colonies. And prison colonies are special. They actually aren't part of the main BGS. Those are just where you respawn after you've been killed with a bounty. Anyways, the population is the only part of this that really matters. The government types do affect what states are strong and weak, but it's not enough to be something to memorize or, work with. The population, however, does affect the system greatly, and population size will actually determine how much of an effort is needed to basically manipulate that system. So, for example, one very active commander would be able to sway a system of 100,000, but you need probably a group of 3 to 5 for about 1 million. And for 1 billion citizens, you'd probably want a group of about 12 or more. And the population also has a happiness level. The happiness level of a faction can also trigger secondary states like civil liberty if the faction is very happy, or civil unrest if the faction is not happy. And factions can also be considered native or non-native. And native factions just means that that's their home system. And non-native factions have expanded into that through BGS manipulation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Next is the states. These states basically determine the current condition of the faction, and there is quite a lot of them, but we'll split them into 3 categories to basically cover them: positive, negative, and conflict states. Starting with the positive states, we have boom and investment. Boom and investment occur when there is a lot of positive interaction with a faction. This brings about better trade prices and better mission rewards, both in influence and materials and credits and stuff like that. Next, there's civil liberty and public holidays. These are both secondary states. Civil liberty occurs when there's an increased happiness in the system. Bounty hunting can contribute to civil liberty. And then there's public holidays, and these usually occur during real-life British holidays, and these just increase the faction's happiness a little bit. Now, the final happiness state is expansion, and expansion is a pretty big one. Expansion is basically how a faction switches to another system or jumps to another system. And to do that, you have to get your influence of your target faction up to 75%, and you have to keep it above there for quite a bit of time. The search radius for expansions is 20 light years, so you can only expand within a 20 light year radius of the system you're expanding from. And during that time, you'll have a decrease in the faction's wealth and influence, and this is basically the cost of moving resources into that next system. Expansions have 5 days of expansion prep, which is where the expansion state is pending. And then after that, there is 5 days in the active state, during which time you would need to complete expansion missions to keep it going. And then a faction must maintain an influence of 75% or higher to start the expansion. And then there is a chance that when you reach 75%, that the expansion won't occur on the first tick. And then you just have to wait one more tick and then it should occur. On to the negative states. There is quite a bit of them, so we're going to go through them kind of fast. First up is bust, and the bust is basically the opposite of a boomer investment. This is when there has been a lot of negative increase, and so trade and exploration data are worse, and your missions are going to be quite bad in terms of your rewards. Next is lockdowns. Lockdowns occur when there's a lot of pirate activity or crimes for a faction. Murdering clean ships and committing crimes during the lockdown can increase its duration, but if you bounty hunt, it'll decrease the duration of the lockdown. And during this time, mission boards that are owned in lockdown will not actually spawn any missions, and the influence level of a faction will not change during lockdown as well. Next is the retreat state, and the retreat is actually the opposite of the expansion state. So when a non-native faction is below 2.5% influence, they enter a retreat state, and if they stay below 2.5 influence for 5 days, they will basically be completely kicked out of the system. To stop this, you have to jump your influence above 2.5% before the 5 days is over. The final negative states are a series of randomly occurring states. These just sort of spawn, and they can all be treated by trading or turning in bounties of some kind. Just has to be relevant to whatever the crisis currently is. These are drought, outbreak, famine, infrastructure failure, terrorism, natural disaster, and blight. And I'll put up on screen right now what you can do to counter each one. And you just basically do enough of whatever the counter is and they should go away. And finally, we have the conflict states. These are basically states where two factions are pitted against each other. First is election. Election occurs when two factions of the same government type, excluding anarchy, are equal in influence. There is no real conflict during an election, but you will see missions that you need to complete, like grab the bag missions, that count towards your election points. Elections can last 7 days. And they are basically a tug-of-war style counter where both factions are competing to win that day. And if you win 4 days, you win the election. During elections, both factions are actually locked at influence, and it is possible for a different faction to actually jump above or below the factions that are in election. Next is war and civil war. War occurs when there's two factions that are different government types and one of them has to be non-native, and then civil war occurs of two faction types when both are native. And war and elections are basically the same thing. It's just different activities to do. Wars are combat activities, so turning in combat bonds helps the wars, and missions help the elections. And it's the same counter style system where you have to win 4 days in a row. And same thing applies there where both factions are locked in influence and a third faction can actually jump above or below them during that time. So the next thing to cover is BGS manipulation. BGS manipulation is basically the term used to discuss how factions interact with systems and what they do with those factions. The goal of most factions is to become the controlling faction of that system by having the highest amount of influence. And to do that, there are basically two methods to use. There's positive interactions and negative interactions. So positive interactions are things that have a increased influence on the system. So things like turning in bounty vouchers, turning in exploration data, completing missions, stuff like that will increase the influence of whatever faction you did it with. The next one is negative actions. These are things that will decrease the influence of a system. So basically, stuff like smuggling, committing crimes, killing that faction's ships, attacking those factions' Odyssey settlements. Those type of things will have a negative effect on the faction's influence. So to take over the system, you want to basically increase your influence while lowering the influence of all the other factions in the system. So you can do this by completing positive interactions for your faction and completing negative interactions for basically every other faction in the system. So these two combined should change the influence of your target faction pretty fast. You're stealing the influence of the factions that are having the negative increase, and you're increasing your own influence at the same time. And one thing I don't get to see talked about a lot is your daily targets. So basically for your daily goals, you want to hit a certain amount of all categories of positive interaction. This will allow you to maximize the amount of influence you earn per day. And so to do this, you want to hit 40 influence pluses. You want to turn in 15 million bounty vouchers. You want to turn these in at 5 million credit intervals. So once you turn in 5 million credits worth of bounty vouchers, any more credits on top of that doesn't really add on to the influence that you earn. So you're capped out. Next is exploration data, which must be sold to a station that's owned by the target faction. You want to sell about 10 million of this per day. And then finally is trade profit. Again, you want to do this at a station that's owned by the faction. And this is about 8 million. So yeah, this is basically my guide on how to work the BGS in Elite Dangerous. I know it's not complete or perfect, but I've been working with it and it's gotten me pretty far. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any updates or questions, please feel free to comment below and I'm happy to help. And anyways, have a good one, guys.